In this podcast, two Gen Xers are taking a trip down memory lane, revisiting and reflecting on the cinema of the 1980s. We'll look at the hits and the flops, the studio blockbusters and art house indies, the critically acclaimed, and the universally reviled. The series is hosted by me, Lisa Molinelli, a writer and librarian, and features Dustin Morrow, a filmmaker, author, and professor of film. So pull on your leg warmers, crank up your boombox, and hop in the DeLorean. It's time for The Long Rewind. Welcome to The Long Rewind. I'm your host, Lisa. With me, as always, is Dustin. You want to tell us? You want to tell us what it is you're singing to the good people at home?
That
today?
was the music from the Canon Films logo. If you are a kid in the 80s or a teen in the 80s, you probably saw a Canon movie, and you may remember this very distinctive logo that from their production company / studio, whatever you want to call it, that came before all of their movies. On one side, it was sort of like a silvery metallic letter C, and on the other side was an arrow. And when they came together, they made this sort of like, it wasn't an octagon, what was it? It was like a hexagon shape, and it had this like very distinctive synth sound, followed by this little parade of drums, like a drum machine.
Yeah, a very 80s logo.
Very, very 80s. And it's just a real, I get nostalgic when I see it. And it just is, it's a real symbol of, it's kind of like, it's the only logo I can think of where I'm like, the logo comes on and you're like, oh, we're going to have a party. like, I don't know whether this is going to be good or bad. It's probably more likely than not going to be bad. But it's going to be fun, and it's not going to be boring. Whatever I'm about to see, it's going to be a ride.
Right.
That's the promise of the Canon Films logo.
That's right. Around here, we call it the Mark of Excellence.
The Mark of Excellence, yeah. So, today we're talking about, it's our first episode I think we've done where we've talked about a production company, essentially.
Yeah, but worthy of talk because it was one of the most, I don't know, what would you call it, sort of interesting and sort of, industrious production companies of the 80s. I'm not sure how else you would describe it.
Yeah, for sure. So Canon Films, which was around in the 70s and around the 90s, but had its glory days in the 80s when it was releasing up to a just absolutely staggering amount of movies a year, up to 40 to 50 movies a year. That's like a movie a week, where most studios were releasing 6 or 7 movies a year. Canon was putting out sometimes in the high 40s,
right?
Which is just mind-boggling to think about until you see the movies and you're like, okay.
And now I see
I
how
kind
they
of get
did
it. I can see the sort of the attention to quality and craftsmanship here. They were just a very interesting company. They were essentially, although not uniquely, a exploitation film company. They did make, as we'll discuss, I'm sure, at some point in this podcast, some art house films and some sort of more prestigious films. Yep. But generally, their trade was exploitation, looking at fads and using genre movies, because they didn't have access to the kind of budgets that the studios had, and so they had to find other ways to compete. And the way they did that was the same way that exploitation filmmakers have been competing since the earliest days of movies, which is by emphasizing genre and sensationalism.
And maybe riding the coattails of current blockbusters or trends.
Yeah, and drafting off of, popular,
ripping
bigger
stuff
budget
off,
movies.
Essentially.
Yeah.
I mean, can you explain, this is something I've never totally understood. It's been more of a like, I know it if I see it. What is the definition of an exploitation film? I've never really totally understood that.
Well, it's essentially what I was just saying. It's like, they're usually low-budget films that exploit sensationalistic subjects, or lean on sensationalistic genres like horror or sex comedies or science fiction. They're films that are made on a low budget and have to try to compete with the movies that are coming out of the studios that are made on a higher budget by selling the narrative or the story hook rather than selling the star or the prestige of the filmmaker.
Because they usually would have neither. Or,
And it's not that like Hollywood, it's a bit of a misnomer that this idea that Hollywood, the general sort of narrative is that Jaws changed everything in a couple of ways in the mid 70s. And one of those was that Jaws made so much money that it made all the studios go, holy cow, you can make this amount of money on a single film. And that had never been sort of thought of. And so it was the birth of the modern day blockbuster.
I see.
The idea that we should make, by we, I mean the studios, the idea that they should make fewer films, but dump more money and attention into those fewer films with the goal that those few films would make the amount of money that they would have made by making, 20 or 30 films. Mm-hmm. It's like why studios today make like 6 or 7 movies a year, if that. Those are big. They're making big movies.
Yeah.
Like it's pretty rare for a major studio to make a movie that costs less than $100 million. Whereas once upon a time, that would have been just insane. And so Jaws changed that. But the part of the narrative I would dispute a little bit is the other kind of consensus among film historians is that Jaws was an A budget, A level B movie. Okay. It's the kind of movie that would have been made by like Roger Corman. Uh-huh. And Roger Corman's one of the guys that says this. If you see interviews with Roger Corman, he always says like Jaws in some ways destroyed my business because my business was making like shark movies or, sex comedies or alien movies. And the studios didn't want to do what they thought was lowering themselves to make those kinds of movies. Mm-hmm. And so he had that field to himself.
The B-movie field,
yeah,
so to
that
speak.
B-movie field. And all of a sudden, when the studios started putting the money into these B-movies, he couldn't compete because he couldn't make B-movies that had
he didn't have the
Roy
budget.
Scheider and Richard Dreyfuss in them and have major budgets where they could actually shoot out on the open ocean and have sharks that looked real. And so, it really hurt him. And other things happened too, of course, but that was the sort of big change. So that's the idea behind an exploitation movie. And Cannon Films is certainly by no means were they doing anything particularly new. In the 80s. They just did it on a bigger scale than anybody had done it. Okay. So, I mean, Corman has been around since like the 50s, I think, is maybe when he started.
Okay.
And he was making, he had made like 100 movies in like a couple of years. Like he was out of the gate just making a ton of films. Most of them just B-grade garbage. He claimed to only have ever lost money on one movie, and it was his one prestige movie. It's a film he directed called The Intruder with William Shatner. It's actually a very good movie, but he lost money on it very early in his career, and he said, I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm not making prestige issue movies. I'm going to make movies with women with big breasts and aliens and monsters and stuff
high
like
action.
That.
Yeah. So would you say that Roger Corman, is Cannon kind of working off the Roger Corman model, or what was their model?
Yeah, they just did it with more aspiration and ambition than Corman ever did. I think Corman never really had this idea that he never aspired to, he didn't ever think he was going to compete with the 20th Century Foxes or the Warner Brothers or the Paramounts of the world. Cannon thought they were. And it ultimately, as we'll talk about in this podcast, led to their demise. Right. That's what did them in. But Cannon really thought they could become one of those studios eventually. Mm-hmm. But making the kinds of movies they did with the model that they used, which was kind of like the Corman model, although with higher budgets, believe it or not. As low budget as Cannon movies are, they're huge compared to like your average Roger Corman movie. Yeah. I mean, the AIP movies, which is American International Pictures, which was a company that Corman worked for his career, or helped found, I think, actually, was making their movies were just abysmally cheap. And Cannon was at least putting $1 million into a movie or, close to it. So they were working at a slightly higher level, and you can see it. And their pictures are so much more watchable than Roger Corman's, and they're a lot better, frankly, for it.
Okay. Maybe we should double back and talk about who Canon was and what they were about.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so Canon Films was run by two first cousins from Israel, a guy named Menachem Golan and his cousin Yoram Globus. Mm-hmm. And they grew up in Tel Aviv going to American movies and really loving American movies. And they became independent filmmakers in Israel in the 60s and 70s and found a good amount of success making movies there, but on very low budgets. And eventually they made a film with a filmmaker named Boaz Davidson called Lemon Popsicle that was kind of autobiographical, based on Davidson's youth. And it became kind of a model for the 80s sex comedy, which eventually became like Porky's.
So does it predate Porky's and things like that?
Yeah, it does.
Oh, okay. Wow.
Lemon Popsicle was 1978. Okay. And it came out, and it was, I think, the biggest grossing movie in the history of the Israeli film industry. Mm-hmm. It was just massive. And it gave them just enough money to purchase an exploitation company that was struggling, called Canon Films. So a lot of people think that Golan Globus founded Canon Films. They actually didn't.
That's
they
what I
purchased
thought,
an existing company.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Canon Films had been around in the 70s. It was making sexploitation pictures like the Happy Hooker movies. There was a whole series like the Happy Hooker Goes to Hollywood, the Happy Hooker Goes to Washington. It's probably most famous movie. Is still pretty obscure. Exploitation movie fans know it. It's a Peter Boyle movie called Joe.
Okay.
And it's about Boyle plays a kind of a working class guy who rebels against it's very kind of like it's like a really, I know Death Wish movies are already kind of right wing. It's a even further right version of those because he goes after leftist hippies.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
But that's essentially what it is. It's kind of like a revenge-ish movie about a working class guy that can't take all the hippies.
Right.
It's very, very 70s. Uh-huh. But anyway, that had nothing to do with Golan and Globus. So that was the company they bought. And they eventually remade Lemon Popsicle a few years into the existence of Canon Films as a movie called The Last American Virgin, which is a very uneven, very bizarre movie that is sort of 50% traditional sex comedy, like very Porky's. There's a scene where all the guys line up in the locker room to measure their wieners and see who has the longest wiener. And there's like, it's just it's that kind of
pretty
stuff.
Crass and coarse.
They go to a prostitute to lose their virginity, and
right.
But it also has this. What it's remembered for, I think, is this weird undercurrent of melancholy, and there's actually some pathos in it, and for anyone who's ever been in an unrequited romantic relationship or been in a relationship where your friend got a girl that you were really interested in, that's what happens in that movie. Okay. Our hero falls in love with this girl who ends up going with his dirtbag friend who uses her and throws her away. And he treats the main guy treats her really well. And she seems like she's going to be interested in him for a moment. And then at the end of the movie, she tosses him away and goes back to the horrible guy who's just better looking. And, she's revealed to be kind of shallow and superficial. And it's a really heartbreaking ending, actually. It's a very uncommercial ending for that kind of movie. And I think people remember that ending as giving the movie maybe a little more credit and depth than it actually really has. But anyway, I digress. But it was a nearly shot-for-shot remake of Lemon Popsicle, which is very strange because it includes all of the weird Israeli cultural...
Or maybe not weird, but stuff that we wouldn't recognize
weird, but
or understand.
Unfamiliar to Americans.
Things
So there's just all these strange things, bags of oranges and... I don't know. There's it's stuff that you're like,
just
what?
Doesn't make sense to an American audience.
To an American culture, but they didn't change it. Yeah.
Right.
Their first big success, I should just say really quick, like the structure of that company was interesting. Menachem Golan was the creative head of the company, and he was this very loud, very passionate, very creative guy, often described by people as a real dreamer. He just lived and breathed movies. He was just constantly thinking of movies. Anytime he met a filmmaker, it was like, what could we do together? And he would pull out a napkin and start writing ideas, and he would even like write contracts on bar napkins that he would demand be legally honored. He was just a very interesting, very loud. Some people thought he was very obnoxious guy who just loved films, and he was the head of the creative aspect of Cannes. He was a film director himself. He directed some of these movies in Israel that he made before coming over here, and he made a few movies for Cannes as a director. Really notable ones. One called The Apple, which is this absolutely insane musical. It's like a biblical allegory, I think.
It's really hard to say.
It's kind of about hippies and peaceniks,
but through the eyes of someone who doesn't really know
doesn't
what
really
that
quite
is.
get them. Yeah, because the Golan and Globus were very conservative, like politically and what have you.
Or just culturally or whatever.
Culturally, I don't think he quite got it.
That shows in the we've both seen
the
this.
Closest kind of approximation to it would be Xanadu.
Sort of.
If you've seen Xanadu, Xanadu is much better.
Yeah.
Believe it or not.
Except that the Apple
the music
has
is better.
Like all these, maybe, like you said, biblical allegory.
Yeah.
Maybe over.
And it has its fans because it is a truly crazy.
It's pretty inscrutable, but nuts. And there's a lot of interesting, weird imagery, I guess.
It's wildly incoherent.
Yes.
He also directed Enter the Ninja, which we'll talk about, and The Delta Force, which we'll talk about later. His cousin, Yoram Globus, was comparatively very quiet, but he was very, very smart, and he was very shrewd, and he was a businessman, and he handled the money side. And really, he went out and raised the money and sold the films and did the deals that allowed Golan to function as the kind of de facto head of the studio and greenlight and actually produce and make movies.
Yep.
But Golan was like, if you watch, there's a couple of documentaries about Cannon films. I highly recommend both of them. One's called Electric Boogaloo, which was made by the Australian filmmaker Mark Hartley, which is a very funny, fast-paced, clip-filled run through Cannon's reign. And there's a lot of it interviews a lot of the actors and filmmakers that worked with them.
Some really interesting people show up that you would be like,
people
wow,
you would never imagine would have worked with this kind of company. And we'll talk about that in a minute too.
Yeah.
The other one is called The Go-Go Boys, and that was a Cannon, or I should say Golan and Globus sanctioned documentary. And it's more about sort of what became of them after they dissolved the company, and kind of follows Golan around in his last sort of year of being alive. And it just shows that he was, to the day he died, still trying to make movies and still trying to wheel and deal, and never stopped loving movies, and was always like, had a million ideas and was very passionate about the projects he made. But one of the things that's cool to see in Electric Boogaloo, especially, there's a lot of archival clips of the two guys in their office. They are sourced from a BBC special that came out in the 80s called, I think it's called The Last Tycoons. It kind of follows them around the Cannes Film Festival, where they were famous guys, and shows Golan like multitasking to a degree that few people could do. Like he would run into an edit bay and cut a trailer, and then run down to his office, make a deal with an actor, and then he would go meet with a director to discuss the footage that they're shooting, and then right after that he would give script notes to somebody, and then he would duck into another edit bay to look at the footage from another movie, how it's coming along, and then he would go recut an ending. And this was just like how he ran every day. Like he was like the Energizer Bunny.
It was clear that these people had a lot of energy and passion, and just to a very admirable degree. Maybe you should explain too, because this is not something I understood, why Golan and Globus would be big at Cannes. Because most of us, I think of Cannes as the fancy film festival where people dress up and go see big movies, right? And there's a red carpet. But there's this other part of Cannes that I didn't know about.
Yeah, Cannes is a very strange place. It's I've been to it once, and it's
To the film festival.
to the film festival, and it's a very it's by invitation only, so it's not like even Sundance or Telluride. You can't go up and buy a
just
ticket.
go get tickets.
It's completely private. It's
Yep.
closed to the public. As a member of the public, the only thing you could do would be to go and watch people go on. Like,
I mean,
walk
I was
down
a
the
member
red
of the
carpet
public
and
when
stuff
I
like
went,
that.
and
But
that's all I could do.
I
Yeah.
managed to get some credentials to kind of go into the festival
Mm-hmm.
one year, and and that was in 2018. And even then, I was like, "Oh, this is exactly like it must have been in the '80s, just on a more subdued
Mm-hmm.
scale, because we don't have the kind of showmanship that we had in the '80s from these kinds of filmmakers like Golan and Globus." But basically, the idea is that, yes, there's a film festival where they premiere movies from around the world. Many of those movies are very highbrow, very artistic,
Yeah, very prestigious. Yeah.
Often European. And those are judged by prestigious juries who give out awards. But while that's happening, there's also this giant marketplace that is the real engine that fuels and funds the Cannes Film Festival, frankly. And that marketplace is where everybody who makes exploitation movies from around the world comes and sells them to international markets. And so the innovative thing that Golan and Globus did in the '80s is they started selling, and this is still done today. There's still producers that operate this way. They would go to Cannes, and they would just have like a poster, or they would buy a billboard, or they would do a publicity stunt, like they would, I don't know, run a famous actor down the middle of the road in a tank, or I don't know, weird.
Yeah.
They would just do this weird
Big
stuff,
stunts.
like big attention-getting stuff. And they were selling movies that hadn't been made yet, which was
Right.
not the common approach. Usually, you would make your movie, your independent movie, your exploitation movie, and you would take it to the Cannes Film Festival and try to sell it to as many markets as possible as would buy it, and hopefully that's where you would turn a profit. But you would have already made the film, so you could show these people the movie.
Yeah.
And that's still largely how Cannes operates. A lot of the movies, most of the movies I saw there were not red carpet movies. They were movies in the marketplace.
they have these screenings you can go to see and see if you want to buy it, right?
Yeah.
I assume. Yeah.
So, but Canon was just taking like posters,
Yep.
or even just ideas for movies. Like Golan would go there and like he would just all of a sudden think of something. He'd be like, Chuck Norris is the American Ninja, and he would like mock up a poster that he'd pulled a picture of Chuck Norris from God knows where, and he would put the title American Ninja under it, and he would sell it to different international markets.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And he would use that money from those sales to then go produce the movie.
Yeah, and these were very lightly conceived, to say the least. I mean, in the sense that they probably hadn't signed the actor to do the thing that they're saying they're going to make. There was no deal to do.
You find that out when you watch the documentary. Some of these movies that they were promising, in fact, a good chunk of them, probably more than often than not, they never delivered because they didn't actually. For example, they would not own the IP. Like they would promise an adaptation of something that they had no business offering because they didn't own the property, or they would offer an act. Like, for example, Chuck Norris in American Ninja was one they sold, and then when they went to go make it, Chuck Norris said, "I'm not making that."
Right.
And they were scrambling to replace him and hopefully like still deliver a movie that they had contractually promised to.
So, I mean, sometimes
produce.
they would technically make the film, but it would turn out to be a very different thing than what they sold. So, it's really interesting.
So anyway, early 80s, their first big hit was, and this in some ways I think was the thing that decided the direction their entire company was going to go in, was Death Wish 2.
Okay.
Death Wish had come out in the early 70s and was a controversial hit, but had lied dormant as a piece of intellectual property ever since. And Charles Bronson's career was kind of on the downturn, so he was an affordable actor all of a sudden. Mm-hmm. And so Cannon saw an affordable piece of IP and an affordable actor, and
whose name had some cachet.
His name still had some cachet, and put them together and back together, I should say, and made Death Wish 2, which was it didn't have a lot of relationship with the original Death Wish, which is actually a pretty serious look. It's based on a book that is anti-vengeance and anti-vigilante, and was kind of a serious look at pacifism and those sort of ideas that politically that are interesting about vigilantism. Death Wish 2 has none of that. It's a cartoon about blowing away punks.
And pretty much the opposite, right? It's kind of like, yay, vigilante.
Yeah, exactly. It was pro-vigilante.
To some degree, yeah.
And it was a big hit for them. I mean, it wasn't a huge hit by the standards of Hollywood, but it was big enough for them to go, oh, this is what we're going to do. We're going to be an exploitation company, essentially. And even though we were making kind of serious indie films in Israel, that's not what we're going to do when we come here. So from there out, it was like a decade of just a mass of movies. And oftentimes they were the creators of trends that just became absolutely massive. So the big examples of that are the ninja craze. Yeah. That originated with Canon Films and breakdancing I mean, they didn't invent breakdancing, but breakdancing movies.
Or like hip-hop breakdancing movies. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. So Golan himself directed a movie called Enter the Ninja, which was a story idea that was brought to him by a martial artist named Mike Stone, who wanted to write the script and star in the movie. And they started to make it, and it became evident right away that Mike Stone couldn't act out of a paper bag, even though he was a great martial artist. And they were in the Philippines, I think, and they were shooting this. And he couldn't stop shooting because it would be too expensive to shut down the film when they had already prepped and they were ready to go. And so there's so many Canon stories, but this is very
classic to their
emblematic of like the kind of
the way they operated,
seat of their pants way that Canon operated. So Golan was like, well, who's in the country right now? And they said, well, there's a film festival going on, the Philippines Film Festival.
I was lucky.
And Franco Nero is there. Franco Nero was an Italian spaghetti Western star from the 70s. And Golan said, what's he doing? Well, he's just seeing movies at the festival. We'll grab him and offer him a bunch of money, and we'll make him the ninja and Enter the Ninja. Yeah. And so he came over and shot it really quick while he just happened to be there. Yeah. That's the kind of strange, sort of weird thing that was always happening with Canon Films. Like I highly recommend those documentaries, especially so Electric Boogaloo, because it's just a nonstop parade of hilarious stories about these two guys that just did not operate in the same way that anyone else in Hollywood did, which is part of why they were just such outsiders. Like they were really rejected by the industry. They were never given a lot of credit. And in fact, they made some really good movies that you could argue would have won a lot of awards and would be looked back on nowadays with more
prestige
and
respect, etc.
That kind of, but because they came from Golan and Globus, they don't have that reputation.
Yeah, I mean, when I say mark of excellence, that we call it that around here, you know what you're getting, and that it's sort of tongue in cheek in the sense that people did not see that as a mark of excellence in especially at that time in reality. So,
but it's important to note that Golan really loved films. He reminds me in some ways of he didn't have the talent of a great director. He's like I don't want to say he's like Ed Wood, because Ed Wood was truly just awful, and Golan could at least make a movie. Yeah. But his passion for cinema was a big deal. And so they actually Canon funded a lot of really respectable directors who in the 80s which was the era of the blockbuster, there were a lot of directors from the 60s and 70s that were actually having a hard time getting their movies bankrolled because they were not commercial directors. They were artistic geniuses. Yeah. And so Cannon funded movies by Jean-Luc Godard, by John Cassavetes, by Andrei Konchalovsky, by Norman Mailer, of all people.
Franco Zeffirelli.
Barbara Schroeder. And all of the movies these guys made, with the exception of Mailer's, got good reviews. Godard's was King Lear, which is a very weird experimental movie that Golan actually ended up hating. But,
Molly Ringwald's in it.
It's Godard. Yeah, wild. Molly Ringwald's in it. Cassavetes made Love Streams, which I think is in the Criterion collection.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, it's it's long, but it's quite a lovely movie. Konchalovsky did perhaps the sort of objectively best Cannon movie, which was Runaway Train, just a phenomenal action movie, adapted from a screenplay by Akira Kurosawa.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, isn't that amazing?
That's really amazing. Wow.
Zeffirelli did a version of the opera of Othello. And Barbara Schroeder made Barfly, which was a critically well-regarded movie with Mickey Rourke and Faye Dunaway as alcoholics. It's based on the life of Charles Bukowski.
Oh.
Mailer, however, made a truly batshit nuts movie called Tough Guys Don't Dance.
Okay.
That's the movie where Ryan O'Neal goes, "Oh man, oh God,
oh, really?
Oh man, oh God," and just keeps screaming that on the beach.
Oh, I'd forgotten about that. Yeah.
It's a wild movie.
I think this is one of those things you can go look up on YouTube just that moment if you're interested.
But what they would do then is they would go to Cannes and they would make a deal with these foreign markets that would never book a movie by like Cassavetes, which is going to be all dialogue and all about human relationships.
Not
they only wanted Chuck Norris movies.
Action.
And they would say, "We'll give you the Chuck Norris movie, but you're going to have to take the Cassavetes movie too."
Yeah.
And in that way, that small way, Cannon like brought a little more art into the world and got it hopefully to audiences that would otherwise not have had access to it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, I mean, there's actually a lot to admire about them, and one of them is they would not let anything get in their way of making a movie.
That's
really.
true.
I mean, they were very resourceful, and just like the story you told, they'd use whatever they could have to hand, to get the movie done. And they did really love movies, whether their talent was up to it or not. And they wanted to do this and they did it. Amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Not everyone can say that.
Lisa and I will go through our top 10 Cannon movies in a moment, but just a couple other things that were sort of interesting about them.
Yeah.
They were what you would probably call a mini major.
Okay.
So
I've never
bigger
heard
than
that.
bigger than a production company, but smaller than a studio.
Okay.
Because they didn't distribute their own work, they still needed a distribution deal.
Okay.
And so they struck a big deal in the mid '80s with MGM that lasted a couple years, and so MGM still actually owns the rights to most of the Cannon library.
Wow, I didn't know that.
They also had a deal with Warner Brothers for a while, more towards the end of the '80s. They also had aspirations to be kind of old school moguls.
Yeah.
And to that end, they purchased theater chains in Europe.
Right. Was it only Europe?
There are laws in the United States that don't allow studios to own theaters.
Sure.
But in Europe, those are more lax. And so there was one point where they owned between 40 and 50% of the theaters in England, which is kind of wild to think about. They also bought studio space at Elstree Studios, which is where they shot much of the original Star Wars. And so they were looking to become more like an actual classic film studio, where they were kind of controlling every aspect of production through distribution.
I think I remember from the Electric Boogaloo documentary that they had a vision of being like having a studio system, like having their stable of stars and, winning Oscars and like that was the vision they had.
Yeah. And they totally did some of that, right? There are actors
I don't think they won
like
Oscars,
Charles Bronson and Chuck Norris and Michael Dudikoff, these who are associated forever with Cannon Films because they made so many of their iconic movies with Cannon.
They definitely had a stable of actors.
There was that story in Electric Boogaloo. I can't remember who told it. I think it was one of the production executives from Cannon who said at one point every script that came into Canon went into one of two piles. They literally had a Bronson pile and a Norris pile, the two Chucks. Right. Which Chuck would the script work better for? And they had these two stacks.
But I think what I took away from that too was literally every script. It wasn't like they threw away some scripts because they weren't good for either Chuck. It was like every script, okay, one of these guys is going to do it. So I think the quote was, even if it was like an adaptation of Wuthering Heights, which Chuck is better for this?
which Chuck would do better?
I leave that
Wuthering
question
Heights.
to you all to think about because that's a hard question. Yeah. But yeah, it was really interesting.
Yeah, they the end of Canon Films came about because, in large part, because of their ambition. They just were making too many movies a year, for one thing. Mm-hmm. They were borrowing too much money, often from kind of shady European businessmen who wanted to be paid. And they wanted to be, they were just so, Golan's dream was to win an Oscar. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And he wasn't going to do that as kind of the Canon Films of the 80s, right? He wasn't going to do that as a purveyor of exploitation movies with Chuck Norris. No. And so he really wanted to make bigger movies that would compete with the studio and get the kind of respect that the studios were doing. And so to that end, when they were already kind of hemorrhaging money from having too many projects in production that weren't generating the revenue to cover their production and distribution expenses, they went all in on these three big movies, one of which was Masters of the Universe, which was based on the toy line and cartoon, but was ill-advised for a couple of reasons. One is that they just didn't have the budget to make that movie what it would be. For example, that series and that cartoon and that whole toy line are set in this mythical planet called Eternia. And so they had He-Man and Skeletor like come to Earth right away in the film. It just looks cheaper than it should be. Right. Well, for a kid who was wanting to go see a He-Man movie, He-Man is what Masters of the Universe is, if you don't remember. You would be like, where's Eternia, right? Like, where's Castle Grayskull? Why am I looking at like suburban Los Angeles? Yeah, it was, Yeah, so they didn't have the money. The other thing was that Masters of the Universe at that time was toward the end of the 80s, was on the downturn. Yeah. The toys weren't selling as well. They weren't producing the series anymore. They were just in reruns. And Canon didn't recognize the real value of, I mean, they should have. The fact that Mattel, which is a major toy company, had to sell the rights to Canon instead of, for example, Warner Brothers or whatever, should have told them right away, like, if they're working with us, this might be in trouble. A lower value product, perhaps. Yeah. The other films that were problems, so that was one of them. That lost a lot of money because it cost like $17 million, which doesn't seem like a lot by the standards of a big studio, but for Canon was a fortune. Canon was spending, on average, $1 million or less on a movie, probably. So it's almost 20 times what they tend to spend. Yeah. And then they did a movie called Superman 4. So Superman 3 had done a lot worse than Superman 2, which hadn't done as well as Superman. And so Christopher Reeve was on the record as saying he didn't want to do the character anymore. It had been several years since Superman 3, which was not critically well received either. And so that property, this is hard to imagine in the 2020s, that property would ever have been inexpensive. Yeah, that is hard to imagine. But it was. And so Canon licensed Superman to make Superman 4. The deal they made with Christopher Reeve was, he could tell any story he wanted. And Christopher Reeve was anti-nukes, as a lot of people were in the 80s when it was a very scary thing. And so he wanted to tell a story in which Superman rid the world of nuclear weapons, which is noble but ill-advised for reasons we won't get into here. There would be a whole nother podcast. But the other thing they did was they gave him a second movie that he could do whatever he wanted with. And so he made a thriller called Street Smart, which is actually one of the best movies Canon ever made. Right, really you talked about that movie, yeah. So that didn't do well because they didn't have the budget to... You mean Superman 4. To do the special effects. Right. There's still a lot of charm in that movie because it still stars Gene Hackman and Christopher Reeve, and they're great.
Yeah.
But it's hard to watch that movie because the effects are so bad. They're so much worse than the original Superman movies.
Yeah.
Even the first one, which came out a full 10 years
I was going to
earlier.
say, and we're talking about a movie that was released far later, too. So, yeah. Wow.
The third problematic movie was Over the Top, the famed arm wrestling movie with Sylvester Stallone.
Yep.
And the reason that was a problem is the fee they paid to Stallone.
Yeah.
And a lot of executives in Hollywood still curse Golan's name because it changed the marketplace for affording stars.
Sort of in the same way Jaws raised the boats for
Over the Top raised the asking price of movie stars because
changed the economy.
He paid Stallone more than 3 times what the highest he'd been paid before by a big studio.
Wow.
The story goes that like the script was terrible and they offered it to Stallone and he was like, I'm not going to do this terrible script about a stupid sport that is not very cinematic.
I don't think you've said yet that it's about arm wrestling.
Arm wrestling, yeah. And so they said, oh, really? Well, how about for this price? And he was like, no. And then they offered about this price. No. And they kept going back to him. And then eventually the reports are anywhere from 15 to 25 million is what they paid him as a salary. And the budget of the whole movie was 25. So actually, I think it can't have been 25, but it was probably...
It was like
if you look at that movie, it doesn't look like it cost more than a few million to make.
Yeah.
So, 80-90% of the budget went to Stallone's salary. And it bombed. I mean, it just didn't do well. And so all 3 of those movies tanked, even though they were way too expensive for a company as small as Canon to pay. And so that really was the nail in the coffin. And it caused a real rift between Golan and Globus. Globus, was the sensible businessman. Golan was the dreamer who was like, as long as we make another movie, we'll be fine. We just have to make the next movie.
Yeah.
And so they eventually split up. What's hilarious about their split, and this is, again, just classic Canon, is that they both immediately went on to form their own kind of smaller versions of Canon films.
Right. And
they started competing on making lambada movies about the dance.
Yes.
It was Brazilian, right?
I'm not honestly sure.
Lambada, the forbidden dance. I think it was from
like
Brazil.
That. Yeah, maybe.
It was like a dirty dance from
and I think
area, like a highly sexualized dance. I think it had its own song, too, but I can't remember what it was.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So that's hilarious because they were both chasing this fad that was like obviously going to be over before they could get the movies in theaters. And they were both trying to get their movie out first.
I mean, they were doing to each other what they used to do.
And the stories of the makings of these 2 lambada movies are hilarious because they were like writing the script on Monday, shooting it on Monday afternoon, and editing it by Wednesday. Like it was just... No major motion picture has been made as fast as these 2 guys were racing through their lambada movies.
Yeah.
I haven't seen either one of them. I've seen clips, and neither one of them looks really watchable.
Right.
But what's funny is that they came out on the exact same day. They ended up going into theaters the same day, and they split what little audience there might have been for a lambada movie, and they both just absolutely tanked.
Yeah, I don't know if this is true, but in that Electric Boogaloo documentary, it made it sound like they literally split it in half, like 50-50, which is kind of funny. Yeah.
I think lambada might have done a little better than the forbidden dance, but it's negligible. They were both giant flops.
Yeah.
This was a thing that happened to them all the way. Like when they made Breakin', they were competing against a studio movie called Beat Street, which was another breakdancing movie, and they were racing to get it in theaters. This was not an uncommon thing for Canon. They were often like they would hear about something a studio was making, and then they would race to do something faster and get it out a little quicker to capitalize on it.
And I think they did get Breaking Out before Beat Street, did they not?
They did, just barely. Yeah. Not like maybe a week or 2 or something like that. But it did outperform Beat Street. It's a better movie than Beat Street. I mean, I like them both, but it is. They were also big on combining like existing genres into like hybrids. They were big on genre hybrids, which is a thing that kind of grew in popularity, the idea in the 80s anyway. But what made canon movies so funny was that they would often combine genres that had no business going together. And they would make these Franken movies that were just bizarre.
Yeah.
One of the most famous of which would be a movie called Ninja 3, The Domination, which is the third in their Ninja trilogy.
Yes.
Which is a movie that is sort of like 30% ninja movie, 30% The Exorcist, and 30% Flashdance.
If you can believe it, folks,
Yeah.
that is what it is. I've seen it. It's true.
It's wild.
Yeah, it's a really wild movie.
Wild movie.
If you've seen it, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, should we go through our top 10 favorite canon movies?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's
you,
do it.
I think before you met me, had never seen a canon movie. Is that
I
right?
had
and
not.
Now I have converted you, and you are a canon fan.
Well, I do. I like all these movies in some way, I should say, that I put on my list. And no, I had not seen any of these 10 movies before I had met you. And there's there's probably a few other canons that I've seen that aren't.
Before we go
this,
into I love canon so much, it's hard for me. Lisa gave me a Canon Films t-shirt a few
I
years
did,
ago. It has the logo on. Like, that's how much I love canon.
Yeah.
Can I just go through
Please.
an honorable mention list? Because
Yes.
it was literally almost physically painful for me to narrow this
Yeah.
down to 10.
I mean, I haven't seen enough to have an honorable mentions list,
Yeah.
but you have.
I'll
so
try to
let's-
do this quick.
Yeah.
But there are some movies here that maybe folks have never heard of that I want to recommend that they check out. If you have the kind of disposition that enjoys, you're predisposed to like exploitation movies and
Or
movies that are
B-movies
just
or-
kind of
yeah.
WTF
Yeah.
crazy movies.
Yes.
That are just built on the idea that they want to just provide you with pleasure and entertainment. Like those
Then
kinds of movies.
Canon is for you if
Yeah.
that's the case.
Okay.
Yeah.
Couple of Chuck Bronson movies, Murphy's Law, where he gets handcuffed to this he's a cop who gets handcuffed to this young woman, has to go on the lam.
Oh,
It's
geez.
really dumb.
It's kind of like the 39 Steps, I guess.
Kinjite, Forbidden Secrets, which is weirdly one of Tarantino's favorite movies, which is Bronson against the Yakuza
Whoa.
coming into L.A. Link, which is a movie where Elizabeth Shue and Terrence Stamp go up against a killer monkey at a
what?
research facility out in like the
What?
Scottish Highlands, I think it is.
What? I
Yeah.
mean, this is what happens, right? Someone
you've never
explains
heard of
a
that
canon.
movie, have
No,
you?
someone
Yeah.
explains a canon movie to you, and you're like, "I'm sorry, did you just pull all those elements out of a hat and put them together?" It's really wild.
they're doing experiments, and he's like a super intelligent orangutan who starts terrorizing Elizabeth Shue in this castle, and Terrence Stamp is the mad scientist.
I mean, it's just like people and concepts that shouldn't go together, right? But
Yeah,
they
it's-
are in a movie together.
it's wild.
Yeah.
King Solomon's Mines, which is an ultra cheap spoof, if you will, I guess, of like the Indiana Jones movies with Richard Chamberlain and Sharon Stone. It seems like it was written by a 12-year-old, which is probably why I really liked it when I was 12. But it's full of like the dumbest. Like now in this scene, they fall into a giant pot where they're going to be eaten by natives. Like it's
Right.
and made into a soup.
Well, and that's what worked about some of these films too, is like people hungry for more Indiana Jones content that couldn't get more Indiana Jones content.
As a
I mean,
kid,
you would
I
go
was
see
like,
it, right?
I mean, after the 12 millionth viewing of Temple of Doom,
Right.
like you're willing to watch King Solomon's
Yeah,
Mines and
exactly.
be happy about it.
Right.
Yeah. Life Force, which was another big budget movie they did with Toby Hooper. Its original title was I think it was The Space Vampires,
Okay.
which is a good title because that's basically
That's
what
what it
it's
is.
about.
Yeah.
It's kind of like a vampire alien movie that turns into a big disaster movie midway through. It's set in London. It's famous for its really hilariously gratuitous nudity
Yeah.
and crazy creature effects. Stars a younger Patrick Stewart, among other sort of storied British actors.
It's a what was it? Didn't they work a lot with Toby Hooper? It kind of sounded
Yeah,
like
they
it.
did they did Invaders from Mars, and they did a Texas Chainsaw Massacre sequel
Yeah.
with him. Yeah. Firewalker, which is another Indiana Jones ripoff with Chuck Norris and Louis Gossett junior Hercules, a hilariously cheap mythical adventure movie about the title character with Lou Ferrigno, of TV's The Incredible Hulk,
Playing Hercules.
famed bodybuilder Lou Ferrigno.
Yep.
And that movie has some of the worst visual effects ever put in a movie that was released into theaters. But it was a hit. It did well. I think I might have saw it in a theater with my
is that
dad,
right?
actually.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's funny. It's so funny. There's a scene where he goes to fight a bear, and he ends up winning the fight by chucking the bear into outer space.
Yeah. Yep.
You can't say it with a straight face. Messenger of Death, which is a movie where Bronson plays an investigative reporter who goes to investigate these murders that are happening in this closed-off high mountain Mormon community. It's one of his few like actual good movies from canon. Good in the sense that like it was good and not good because it was just crazy and
Not so bad.
and
It's
idiotic.
Good.
Yeah. Which you can't say about my next recommendation, 10 to Midnight, which is a Bronson movie where he's hunting a serial killer who likes to strip nude before he
You've told me
chases
about
down his
this.
victims.
Yeah.
It is one of the sleaziest movies of the 80s. So if you enjoy sleaze, which I do on occasion, 10 to Midnight is going to be right down your alley. Not for the easily offended, perhaps, though.
Yeah.
Enter the Ninja, which was the original Ninja movie. I was a huge Ninja fan as a kid. I got Ninja magazine.
Wow.
I
Yeah.
had a ninja costume.
Yep.
I had throwing stars that I would go out in my parents' backyard and chuck at a tree.
What amazes me is your parents bought you actual, I mean, I don't know that they were authentic, but metal throwing stars with points on them that you could actually throw into a tree.
They weren't
Incredible.
They were kind of dull. They were rounded, pointed.
But still,
so
you could
but they would
throw
stick
them
in a
and
tree if you threw them hard enough. Yeah. No, I
that
had
amazed me.
nunchucks.
Yeah.
I remember hitting myself between the legs several
Yeah.
times with trying to do cool tricks with my nunchucks, and I had a sword. I had all kinds of ninja stuff. I was so into ninjas.
I don't think you were alone.
Ninjas were
Yeah,
a huge,
they were.
huge fad. There was a Chuck Norris cartoon that had all these ninjas in it. Chuck Norris Karate Commandos. Like they were showing up in some big budget movies too on occasion, and that all started from canon. I don't think anybody knew what a ninja was until Golan.
That's what it sounds like.
Golan kind of introduced it culturally to all of us with these hit movies.
Yeah.
Yeah. Rappin', which is... How do you explain rappin'? Rappin' is like for rap music what breakin' was for breakdancing, which is to say it's this very sanitized, G-rated, and probably not at all representative of the actual culture of hip-hop rendition of rapping.
It's also supposed to kind of be the story of Robin Hood, but in...
Yeah, it's
like a
Mario
modern
Van Peebles
urban
plays a guy who gets out of the
milieu.
clink and goes back to his old neighborhood and kind of becomes this Robin Hood figure in his neighborhood. But the whole movie is kind of told through some of the worst rap music you've heard in your life.
In fact, I think his character's name is Rappin' Hood.
It is.
I'm
It's
not
Rappin' Hood.
mistaken. Yeah.
It's so bad.
I
love it so
I do.
much.
I love it too. There's some really fun. Like I'm thinking of there's like a scene where a bunch of kids rap and it's like adorable.
Yeah.
It's so cute. But I've
There's
actually
a scene where they do a whole rap about how much their friend likes snacks.
Oh, is
Remember
that's
how
in
much
that
he likes
one.
to
Yeah,
snack?
yeah.
That's the kind of rough of the streets hip hop movie this was.
I'll mention I had this on my top 10 because it's one of 10 movies I've seen
Nice.
from canon. So it is in
Nice.
there and I enjoy it. It's fun.
Breakin' 2, Electric Boogaloo,
Yeah.
where this was after Breakin' was a hit, they got Breakin' 2 into theaters 5 months later, which is mind melting to think about.
Yep.
It was just Golan after the first week's grosses of Breakin' came in. He went, now we make a sequel. It will be called Electric Boogaloo, which was a nonsense word that Golan made up.
He just
That's
made it up.
sort of what happened.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, Electric Boogaloo is the standing joke for everybody.
Yeah,
who's
blank
making fun
to
of
Electric Boogaloo,
Yeah, like
right.
an unnecessary sequel
Yeah.
has always become Electric Boogaloo. Breakin' 2 makes Breakin' 1 look like Boys in the Hood. It's like a cartoon.
It is.
It's the farthest thing from a gritty street movie as you could actually imagine.
It sure is. I also put this on my top 10 because yeah.
So Ninja 3 is on my list too. That's the aforementioned crazy hybrid about a an evil ninja that is killed in really like the most amazing opening 10 minutes of any action movie you'll ever see.
Yeah,
the first 10 minutes of Ninja 3, if you don't want to watch the whole movie, I get it, but watch the first 10 minutes.
It's set on a golf course.
It is wild.
Yeah.
And he's killed, and he transfers his soul into a woman who is a phone line worker and a
aerobics
like
instructor.
a dance aerobics instructor.
Yeah, and this is the same. The lead of Ninja 3 is the same as the female lead in Breakin'.
Yeah,
Yep.
Lucinda Dickey. They went all in on her. Those movies were shot back to back. Like she finished one, got on a plane, and went and shot the other.
Yep.
They thought she was going to be the next big star, and they were wrong. Avenging Force, which is a really fun action movie set in New Orleans with Michael Dudikoff and Steve James.
That is pretty fun.
Take on the most dangerous game. Runaway Train, which was, as I mentioned, probably the only legitimately great movie they released.
It's
like
the
objectively great. It was nominated for several Academy Awards.
Yeah.
Has these John Voight, Eric Roberts, Rebecca De Mornay, has these incredible actors. It's shot amazingly. It has a real European art house director that gives it a real interesting look and feel. It's just a great movie.
It's one of few canon movies that you would not know was a canon movie if no one told you. You just would be like, oh, yeah, this is really good.
And the movie I mentioned earlier that Christopher Reeve wanted to make as part of his deal to make Superman 4 was Street Smart, which is just a really cool thriller. He plays a reporter who comes up, he promises his magazine a story about the day-to-day life of a pimp in New York, and he can't get any actual pimps to talk to him. He tries really hard, but nobody will talk to him, and so he fabricates the story. And Morgan Freeman plays this actual pimp who reads the story and thinks that it's about him because it so closely mirrors some of what he's doing as a criminal, and thinks that somehow Christopher Reeve has gotten this information about him, and so he starts terrorizing Christopher Reeve and wanting to figure out how, and Christopher Reeve is sort of like letting him do it because he sees that the story becomes a big sensation. Now he sees that he can actually write like a real story and continue it on and use it to advance his career.
Right.
And it's just a great thriller that is also this interesting meditation on journalistic sensationalism and journalistic ethics. And Morgan Freeman is just unbelievable in it. He's so scary. He's one of the scariest villain performances of the 80s, I think. Okay, into the top 10. You want to give me your number 10? We'll just go back and forth.
Well, I should preface this by saying my top 10 is probably literally almost all, not quite all, but almost all of the canon films I have seen. There may be a few that are not on here. I had Masters of the Universe.
Okay, that was my number 5.
Were
you a Masters of the Universe fan as a kid?
I was a big She-Ra person.
Yeah.
My brother loved He-Man. I mean, I watched He-Man. I was a fan. I was more into She-Ra than He-Man, but yeah.
Yeah, I was a big He-Man
of course
kid. I had all the He-Mans.
Yeah.
And so I was excited about this movie, and I get why fans of the franchise don't like it for all the reasons we were mentioning earlier.
Yeah.
It only brings over a few of the characters that are in the cartoon.
And then it makes
sends
up
them
some
to
out of whole
Earth,
cloth.
and it gives them this sort of Spielbergian kind of bizarre story to go through. Having said all that, we were so starved for like live action versions of any cartoon or comic book character or superhero in the 80s that it was almost a default that you would find yourself loving on some level anything that they made that was live action. So
we should say who was in this too.
With Dolph Lundgren in his first kind of lead role.
He played He-Man.
Frank Langella plays Skeletor. He's a delight.
That's why it made my top 10. I think he's just so much fun.
And he loves that movie. He totally will sing the praises of. He says it's like one of the most fun jobs he had as an actor.
You can tell he was having a blast.
His kids loved it. He did it for his kids or his grandkids, maybe.
Yeah.
And you could tell he's having the time of his life.
Oh yeah, hamming it up. Yep.
Yeah. My number 10
Courtney
was...
Cox is in it too.
Yeah, Courtney
by the
Cox
way.
is in it. Yeah, it's
wacky.
It's pretty goofy, but it's fun.
I think it's fun.
It's a lot of fun. My number 10 was Invasion USA. Was that on your list?
I didn't. I was on the fence about Invasion USA and Delta Force are like the two Chuck Norris canon movies that I have seen.
Yeah.
And I like them both pretty well. I thought about putting Invasion USA on here. It didn't make my list, but I considered it.
Yeah, Chuck is he's like, I don't know if he was CIA
I don't
or what
even
he
know
was.
what he is. Yeah,
some kind of, maybe he was Delta. I don't know what he is. He's like a retired something or other.
He's Chuck Norris,
and he's called back into action when terrorists invade the United States. And the premise of that was essentially the premise of the movie, is what would happen if we had an actual like ground invasion of the United States by terrorists. And so it's Chuck. It's just one kind of disconnected set piece after another. Like they trash a mall. There's like a big action scene in a mall where they're driving trucks through their mall. There's a scene where they blow up every house on this block.
I mean, that's my favorite. That's why this film should maybe have made my top 10. I love the story behind that.
Yeah,
I think
it's a great
amazing.
canon. It's a great canon story. It's typical of them. So they found out that there was going to be an expansion of a airport in
like
Florida. I don't know if it was Jacksonville or where it was.
Yeah.
But they were going to essentially demolish this mall and this whole neighborhood of houses. And so Cannon was like, well, if we'll pay you if you let us blow them up.
Yeah.
And so they went in and they trashed the whole mall, and they literally exploded all the houses.
So when you watch this, they're like actually blowing up a bunch of houses.
Real suburban
and destroying a real mall. Like, I think that's amazing.
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
It's really crazy. Yeah.
What was your number 9?
That was Ninja 3, The Domination.
Yeah.
It's so crazy. You have to kind of love it.
Yeah, it is. Every scene is crazier than the next. It has one of the most disgusting love scenes ever involving
I never need to see that
V8
again,
tomato juice.
Oh boy.
It has like dancer size. It has ninja killings.
Sho Kosugi's in it.
Sho Kosugi, the great Sho Kosugi is in it. Yeah, it's wild.
It's really crazy.
My number 9 was Cobra.
That's my number. Wait, where are we at? 8 is Cobra. For
Okay,
me.
yeah.
So, yep.
So tell me why you love Cobra beyond the use of scissors on pizza.
Well, that's one of the reasons. So, yeah, I mean, I just think it's a really wild Sylvester Stallone movie.
It's a very standard cop movie where he's chasing a serial killer who leads a cult.
Yeah. I think Cobra has a lot of braggadocious style, which is kind of fun.
Yep.
And I do think it's hilarious that, I mean, there's this scene where he just like walks into his bachelor pad and there's like pizza lying on the table and he picks up a pair of scissors and cuts a piece of pizza with scissors. I don't know. It's captivating. And Brigitte Nielsen. I think that's right.
Yeah, this was during the era where he was married to Brigitte Nielsen.
I just think it's like kind of Sly goes over the top, movie.
Yeah,
and it's fun.
Yeah, it's pretty nuts.
Yep.
It's just it's sort of like ground zero for what you would imagine a spoof of an 80s like badass cop movie, like McBain on Simpsons, even though that's a Schwarzenegger character.
I mean,
this
is like if you made Sly Stallone.
Yeah, it's as generic in a good way as those kinds of movies got, those kind of 80s cop thrillers
and
got.
Yet it's not a spoof. Wasn't this supposed to be something else? Like, was this what
This was Beverly Hills Cop.
For Sly Stallone it was. I mean, that's what he thought it should be or something.
Yeah, the story is Stallone was going to do Beverly Hills Cop, and he started rewriting it to fit his persona better, and eventually it didn't look anything like Beverly Hills Cop as we know it, and he left the project, but he took his script with him, and it became Cobra. So
it's just really a bit of a mind melt to think about that when you watch Cobra and you watch Beverly Hills Cop and you're like, whoa, things could have been weirdly different. Anyway,
So that was what was your, did I get your 9?
Yes, that was Ninja 3 and my 8 is Cobra.
Your 8 is Cobra. My 8 is Delta Force.
Yeah. I almost went with Delta Force on the list.
Yeah.
Mainly because of the wild plane stuff, the stuff on the plane.
So Delta Force is one of the movies directed by Menachem Golan. And it was a direct sort of fairy tale response to the actual true life TWA hijacking tragedy that happened in the 80s. And it was sort of like, it's almost Tarantino-esque, what he does with Inglourious Bastards. It's sort of like, here's a much better ending for this actual horrible, tragic event.
Yeah.
But it's a bizarre movie because it's like two movies in one. The first hour of it is a hijacking thriller, like just a melodrama with all of these old Hollywood stars like Martin Balsam, Robert Forster, Shelley Winters, just this all-star cast.
Lainie Kazan.
Yeah, Lainie Kazan. Just this, like, exactly what you would expect of a disaster movie, like the old airport movies.
Yeah.
And then the second half is your typical Chuck Norris action movie.
Yeah.
Lee Marvin's in there, which is a lot of fun. So it's Lee Marvin and Chuck Norris kind of blasting around the Middle East. And it's a pretty politically incorrect movie, especially, coming from an Israeli filmmaker. There's some troubling political aspects of this movie. But if you can look past those things and just see the 80s cheese, it's all there. And it can be a lot of fun.
Yeah, my understanding.
As a kid, of course, I didn't get any of that.
Sure.
I just saw Chuck Norris shooting rockets out of the back of his motorcycle. I just thought it was the coolest thing I'd ever seen.
Yeah, my understanding from the Electric Boogaloo documentary is that Shelley Winters and Menachem Golan had some knockdown, drag-out fights. By the way, which is sort of
apparently that airplane was like well over 100 degrees
really
that they were shooting in with no ventilation.
It sure looks like it.
Yeah, it'd just be hellish. It sounded like a horrible shoot.
Yep.
Yeah. What's your number 7?
I put Rappin' because
Rappin', yep.
ridiculous
Rappin' Hood,
fun.
as we mentioned.
Yeah.
My number 7 is American Ninja.
Yeah, I know you love American Ninja.
I do love American Ninja. So it was supposed to be Chuck Norris, as we mentioned earlier, and the reason Chuck didn't want to do it is he didn't want to cover his face with a ninja hood.
You don't want to cover that beautiful, glorious
visage. Cover that beautiful beard.
No, or that beard, yeah.
Yeah, and so he refused to do it. So they went out and they found a newcomer, and that ended up being Michael Dudikoff, who made several of these and made another movie with another few movies with Canon Films, including The Avenging Force, which I mentioned earlier, which is a lot of fun. But American Ninja is a Philippine set movie. It's exactly what you would think it is. It's an American guy who has the skills of a ninja and has to put them to use to save a girl. And, it's pretty rote ninja stuff, but it's done with a lot of style, and it's a lot of fun. What's your number 6?
Breakin' 2, Electric Boogaloo.
Yeah.
Mostly on the strength of the use of the gimbal room.
Yeah.
I can't think. I always get the two breakdancers' names mixed up, so I don't want to mess that up.
But, Ozone is the older one.
Right, and Boogaloo Shrimp.
Boogaloo Shrimp is the younger one.
And his work in that gimbal room is pretty fabulous. It's worth watching just for that, I think. So he and what I mean by that is, he basically breakdances on every surface of a room, so it looks like he's dancing on the ceiling and dancing on the walls, much like Fred Astaire in Royal Wedding, or any other thing.
Which was the inspiration for it.
It was the inspiration for it.
Menachem Golan said, "I want him to do that." Fred Astaire thing,
which is, and frankly, he's sort of the same breakdancer. Boogaloo Shrimp does sort of a Fred Astaire homage in the first movie too. Yeah. So I love that, and I think it's really fun.
That room was used in a few kind of iconic
many
80s
times
scenes, most famously Nightmare on Elm Street.
Oh, okay.
One of the deaths, a young woman she slides up the ceiling and then slides onto or slides up the wall and slides onto the ceiling.
Yeah.
It was done in the same room where they shot that. Yeah, that movie is fun. It's like a cartoon. It's so colorful. Everything's
very colorful.
Hyper neon colored.
Yeah. It's ridiculous, but yeah.
As goofy as Breakin' is, and Breakin' is deeply, deeply goofy.
Breakin' 2
is even more so. Like there's a scene in a hospital where they're all dancing around that is so over the top. It's insane.
Yeah. Yep.
But it's a lot of fun. And speaking of over the top, that's my number 6.
And that is my number 5.
Yeah.
Yeah, Over the Top.
Over the Top, which is a funny movie because It's an arm wrestling movie, and I was going to say it's not what you would expect from an arm wrestling movie, except that I don't think you would expect anything because there is no such thing as an arm wrestling movie.
What would one's expectation be? Yeah,
as far as I know, this is it.
The only one.
Yeah, but it has all of this family drama.
It does.
In it.
That's most of what it is.
And the bulk of the movie is actually not kind of arm wrestling fights. It's this guy and his son trying to reconnect as they drive across the country in this big semi truck.
Yep. Because so the main character is Lincoln Hawk or Hawks, depending on
what point
who is delivering the line in the movie.
Yeah, they call him Hawk and Hawks. Like
it's
all
never
through the
clear
movie. It's like
what
they couldn't
his
decide what the name
actual name is. Is played by Sylvester Stallone, who is the estranged father of this little kid, and he goes to pick him up from military school, I think. And they set off on. And Lincoln Hawk or Hawks is a semi truck driver, and so that's they drive.
Yeah, and it's often criticized because of how uncinematic a thing
arm wrestling
is, except that some of it's pretty exciting and pretty fun. Yeah, I mean, I don't know, I like it.
For the love of God, everyone.
It has a
great
80s soundtrack with Kenny Loggins and Journey. There's
it does
all
have
kinds
a good
of great
soundtrack.
Music on it, and it's a brisk 90 minutes. Robert Loggia is the villain, and he's kind of fun.
Oh yeah, that's right.
I don't know. It's not a boring movie at all.
I mean, there's the whole double elimination round. Let's not forget, for the love of God, everyone, the arm wrestling section at the end. They won't let you forget it's a double elimination.
Yeah, the announcer keeps explaining the rules over and over and over again to the point where it becomes
like, all right. You
start to feel like you're losing your mind if he's going to explain the rules to you one more time.
Yeah,
it's nuts. What was your number 6?
We already did that. Oh. My number 6 was Breakin' 2.
Okay, what was your number 5?
My number 5 was Over the Top.
Mine was Masters of the Universe. Okay. What's your number 4?
My number 4 is Breakin'.
All right, my number 4 is probably your number 1.
Okay.
It's Bloodsport.
Well, I sort of have a tie for 1. I couldn't decide between 1 and 2 for my 1. So Bloodsport is up there, though.
All right, let's talk Breakin' and Bloodsport.
Okay.
So Breakin', as we've mentioned, the breakdancing movie that they race to get out before Beat Street.
Yes.
I like it just because, I mean, the narrative is terrible. What narrative there is. It is just a parade of like some of the most fun dance sequences you can imagine. It's a very colorful movie. The soundtrack is fantastic. I remember buying it on cassette when I was a little kid and just playing the hell out of it.
Yeah, the dancing's superb. And keep your eyes open for Jean-Claude Van Damme.
And exactly. Yeah, he shows up as an extra in one scene. He's wearing a unitard onesie and dancing his heart out. It's pretty hilarious.
It's great.
And once you know he's back there, you can't see anything else. Like it's the only thing you'll ever look at when you watch the movie.
He's working hard.
He's in the scene on Venice Beach. Yes. It comes about 12, 15 minutes into the movie.
It's like a Venice Beach dance scene.
I've seen Breakin' so many times, like I could recite what little dialogue there is. Like most canon movies, it knows how to get in and get out. Like almost very few canon movies are longer than like 90, 95 minutes. Yeah. And most of them just move like really fast. Like they don't give you time to.
There's no development.
That's part of how they work. Part of their MO is they move so quickly that you don't have time to realize how idiotic the storyline is that you're watching.
That's true. There's not a lot of development of character or storyline.
That's certainly true of our other pick here, which is Bloodsport, which is Van Damme's big starring debut. He had been in some other movies, but it was his first heroic lead. Yeah. It's your standard issue. It became like a movie that Van Damme made over and over and over again in the 80s, where he competes in some 90s. Kind of underground martial arts tournament overseas.
In this case, the Kumite.
In the Kumite, yes. What's exceptional about Bloodsport, first of all, it just does that story better than any of the other movies that have that exact same plot, largely because the supporting cast is so much fun.
Oh, yeah.
His John Matuzak, his sidekick is hilarious. The villain is better in it. Forrest Whitaker is in it. It's just, that's right. It's got some really colorful side characters. Yeah. The fight scenes are just fantastic. It has a really fun soundtrack. Yeah, it's just it's. I
don't know how to explain why I love it,
just so
but
much
it is so much fun. Yeah, it's a really good time. I also think it's interesting that the guy who came up with the story, I don't know if he wrote it, but
Frank Dukes.
Yeah, a guy named Frank Dukes
is his name, and so
he claims it's real.
He claims it's a true story. It has been over and over again debunked, but
Yeah.
he continues to claim that it's all true that he fought in this Kumite and set all these records. And in the end credits,
Yeah.
it puts up the title of like it just legitimizes it seemingly by giving you all of these records that he broke, and
Yeah.
it makes no sense. No. Frank Dukes is full of stories. He's claimed to be like an undercover CIA agent and had been on all these adventures and saved the world. And like most people are like, this is not true.
It's fun to think that the Kumite might be real, but it is not, as far as we're aware. Yeah.
Yeah. Who knows?
Who knows? I couldn't say for sure. Right.
So what was your number 3?
My number 3 was Runaway Train.
Yeah. Just a great movie.
Yeah,
it's about a prison break. Voight and Eric Roberts break out of this prison in the snowy Rockies and end up escaping on a train, which what's the guy that drives the train? Why am I brain?
The engineer,
dies, and the train becomes a runaway train.
Yeah.
And then the authorities become aware that they are on there and are trying to recapture them, and there's a really interesting relationship between Voight's character and Roberts' character, and Rebecca De Mornay shows up.
I forget how she gets involved, but yeah, it's so good. It's just a really
she's
legitimately
like a stowaway on the train, maybe.
Yeah, that's kind of what I remember.
Yeah, it's just a really solid action movie.
Yeah, it's legitimately good.
Yeah, with these almost sort of like Shakespearean overtones to it, like these big, grand, philosophical kind of musings.
And like you said, it's well shot. It looks good for, what it's supposed
both
to
Voight
be.
and Roberts were up for Oscars. I don't know if it was up for others, but both the lead actors were nominated.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's really good.
Mine was Breakin'. What's your number 2?
Well, again, it's not really number 2. It's really a tie for number 1.
Okay.
Let's talk about Revenge of the Ninja, because
that's my number 1.
That's your number 1. Yeah. It's so good. I love Revenge of the Ninja.
Words that you never thought would come out of your mouth.
If you told my teenage self that I
would one day love a movie called Revenge of the Ninja,
or Bloodsport for that matter, because I knew Bloodsport back in the day. I didn't know Revenge of the Ninja. I would have thought you were insane, truly. But now I think they're great.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
What kills me about Revenge of the Ninja, which I have loved since I was a little kid, it was the first ninja movie I ever saw. I was like at a sleepover, and my friend Andrew, who was the only other kid in my class who also had a ninja outfit and nunchucks and was really into this stuff like I was. He's like, I'll never forget this. We were like both 8 years old or something. He's like, you're not going to believe this movie. It's amazing. It's going to blow your mind. And he was right. Yeah, it did. I loved it. Sho Kosugi, who is a famed Japanese martial artist,
amazing.
Played the lead in
amazing.
it. It was his first sort of lead movie or lead role as a hero in a movie. And he became kind of the face of the ninja movies throughout the 80s. He's in both Enter the Ninja and Ninja 3. And then he makes like 9 Deaths of a Ninja. He makes a movie called Pray for Death. He did a lot of ninja movies.
Oh, yeah, Pray for Death.
In fact, when they tried to reboot ninja movies about a decade ago, he played the villain in a Wachowski brothers movie called Ninja Assassin.
He's just amazing.
He's just
so
phenomenal.
Amazing.
He's such a magnetic presence on screen.
And I mean, his fight choreography.
Yeah, and does most of his own stunts
and
his own fighting, does all the choreography for the fighting. And it's just Revenge of the Ninja, while ridiculous narratively, is just one crazy action sequence after another.
Just kick-ass action scene after another. They're really good.
One unbelievable. Yeah. You just can't believe what you're seeing, because the movie was made for $500,000 in Salt Lake City, Utah, by a bunch of inexperienced filmmakers, and it was Sam Firstenberg's kind of first big movie as a director, and big meaning like bigger than $20,000 or whatever. $500,000 is not a big movie.
Sam Firstenberg also directed Breakin'.
Yeah,
and maybe even Breakin' 2.
He made Breakin' 2.
Oh, he made. I thought he did Breakin'. Okay, Breakin' 2. Yeah.
Yeah. It's just full of these. You just look at it and you're just like, I can't believe people actually did this. Like, you're looking at these stunts and you're like, how did this movie not have like 12 deaths on the set? Because it's just one crazy action scene after another, and you just can't believe what you're seeing.
It's just incredible set pieces all the way through. And almost quite literally, all the main characters and supporting characters, pretty much all of them are ninjas. Like, even if you don't think someo's going to be a ninja, they're probably a ninja.
Yeah, there's an elderly woman,
who's
and
a
like
ninja.
3/4 of the way through the
it's
movie, you find out she's a ninja.
incredible. Literally everyone's a ninja.
Yeah, everybody's a ninja.
Yeah.
You get a ninja, and you get a ninja.
It's wonderful. It's fabulous.
So that was your number 2?
Well, no, because again, I tied it with Bloodsport.
Okay.
I think they're both fabulous.
So my number 2 to wrap this up is, might as well go out on the most bananas movie Canon ever made.
Yeah.
Which is saying something, because
that is saying
Canon
something.
specialized in bananas. But I think the craziest movie they ever made was a movie called Death Wish 3.
Oh, of course.
So
yes.
there were like 5 Death Wish movies. So this one came right in the middle, which would make you think there's nothing to make it stand out from any other bad sequel or even bad Death Wish movie. But would you be wrong? This is a movie that took sort of what they started to do with the kind of cartooniness of Death Wish 2 and took it to a whole nother plane of existence. It is it just is what it is. It's a live action cartoon. It is crazy.
It's a vigilante movie.
It's a vigilante movie.
Taken to another level. Yeah.
Yeah. Bronson's character, who's already an established vigilante by this point, gets a letter from his friend saying, my neighborhood in New York, I think they're in the Bronx, although it was shot in London, is falling apart because of this horrible street gang that's moved in. It's terrorizing all the old people that live here. And so he comes in, and it's all these senior citizens being terrorized in this building. And Bronson just proceeds to take out the trash for 90 minutes.
Basically.
It has some of the most cartoony, colorful kind of gang member young punks.
They sort of look like a Mad Max gang in a way.
Sort of, and sort of just like what you would imagine a kid would imagine a gang looks like. It's just one like
of those
G.I.
things
Joe characters almost.
Right. One of those things you see in Golan Globus movies is just like people who don't know what this thing is, here's their version of it, right?
It's
Whether
90
punks
minutes.
Or hippies or
I would
whatever.
say probably 75 of those 90 minutes are Bronson just dispatching punks.
Right.
And the last 30 minutes is just one big action sequence where it's just Armageddon in this neighborhood, this like New York neighborhood, just
quote unquote
one man army stuff. And it's crazy, and it's just hard to, I know that doesn't sound like it's any different from any other vigilante movie. It's just hard to describe how this movie does it at a level that no other of those sorts of movies does it. The only thing wrong with it, I will say, is it has like all of Michael Winner's movies, has a pretty offensive scene in it. Yes. Which I always fast forward through. But you have to, I won't watch, he was a sadist and kind of a pervert, Michael Winner, the English filmmaker, kind of a known sadist. His crew hated him. Yeah. Everybody who apparently worked with him kind of hated him. But the guy could make a lean, mean action movie, that's for sure. And so, you have to overlook some stuff to get to the good stuff, but boy, the good stuff is a lot of fun.
You have to find that type of action vigilante stuff appealing to enjoy it, I think. But a lot of people love it. It's probably the one that people like the most is Death Wish 3, seems to me, from what I've heard. So. Yeah.
Well, and I think it's like, I don't think you have to be, those movies get criticized for being these sort of masturbatory right-wing fantasies. And I'm obviously not that. I'm a lefty, and I still love them because their politics to me are so shallow and so
they're kind of beside
laughable.
The point. Yeah.
That especially when like Bronson was kind of a lefty, like like the people, they don't have the courage of their convictions, I guess, which is a good thing. They're just so goofy that it's impossible to kind of, I think, get actually offended by. Well, you're saying it's not like propaganda. That. You're saying, right? It doesn't really have the force or belief of propaganda. No, it's just there to entertain, really. It's just there to show you. Yeah, it's just the punks in it could be anybody. I mean, Alex Winter is one of the punks. Yeah. If you know from Bill and Ted. Yeah. So
that tells you something, I think.
But they could be anybody. Yeah. They could be terrorists. They could be Russian
I see what you're
army.
saying. Yeah,
they could be,
they're just
like,
a
it doesn't matter.
stand-in.
They're just there to set up an action sequence, which is going to make you laugh at its excess.
They're sort of a chess piece. Yeah, I mean, that's all they're... No, it's true. It's really... It's there to entertain. It really doesn't have a message, I don't believe. Yeah.
All right. We've gone very long for our show.
Well,
we don't usually go this long.
Canon is a big deal in the 80s.
But Canon was... Yeah, it's a big subject. We probably should have split it into a couple episodes. Because they're such a big topic. They were such a huge part of 80s genre cinema. Mm-hmm. And I'm glad they exist. And even though, like, if you watch these documentaries, there are a lot of people in there who worked with them who still kind of, like, curse their names because they were pretty shady business guys and notorious for, like, not paying the crew or shortchanging people or, just unethical.
I'm not sure they treated anybody really well physically on a film set, right? Because they were just there to get it done. So
there was
it didn't
that funny
matter.
story that Bo Derek told when they were making a movie with her where I can't remember why she left. Did she just go to the bathroom or something? But she was in their office and she was out of the room and they went through her bag and pulled out some photographs of her, stole them, and then used them in the poster for the art that they took to Cannes. Yeah, which is hilarious. It's just so indicative of them, like these guys who would do anything to get their movies made, regardless of how unethical it might or questionable it might have been.
Yeah, that was one thing that struck me about watching that documentary was the talking heads. People seem to either like kind of have a funny affection for them or think they were terrible. There wasn't really a lot of in between. You either kind of loved them or hated them, I think.
Which is sort of leading up to what I was saying, which is I think you can do both, right? I think you can recognize that they were kind of these shady, kind of carnival barker, charlatans, these shady guys. But at the same time, boy, did they make a lot of really fun entertainment. It wasn't good for you. It was going to give you cavities. Yeah. It was not nourishing. With just a few exceptions, you weren't going to see any kind of really actually good cinema. Right. But man, when you just need to shut off your brain and relax and have a good time and have some laughs with your friends, it's hard to do better than the kind of stuff that they were churning out.
And they loved and believed in what they did, as far as I could tell. Movies. I mean, you have to admire that. So, yeah.
Menachem Golan lived, breathed, and slept movies, and God bless him. Mm-hmm. R.I.P. Menachem Golan.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you for listening, everybody. Sorry we went so long. Hopefully it was interesting and informative, and now you know a little bit about these two crazy characters from the 80s.
It's quite a story.
That made all of these special movies.
All right.
Bye now.
Bye. You've been listening to The Long Rewind. The program is produced by Dustin Morrow and hosted by me, Lisa Molinelli. If you enjoy the show, please consider hitting the subscribe button, leave us a good review on your podcast app, and tell your friends about the program. We'll see you next time. Thanks for listening.